I've got a confession to make. I never used to train hamstrings. That mistake kept my legs skinny for the longest time, and I started to develop imbalances. I got injured super frequently, and it's just honestly one of my biggest regrets looking back now that I didn't do when I started training. So in this video we're continuing the muscle growth series, and today it's all about hamstrings. But if you've not watched any of the other videos, we're going through each of the different muscle groups, giving you tips and advice and workouts on how to build them most effectively. So if you enjoyed this video, make sure you go back to the start of the series and watch all of the episodes. Like, why didn't someone tell me all this when I started the gym? I would have seen progress so much faster. But strengthening your hamstrings is so important for injury prevention, athletic performance, especially if you're someone who runs, because pulling your hamstring can be quite common. So that's just one reason why building our hamstrings is so important. You can kind of think of the hamstrings as the biceps of the lower body. So in order to understand how we can train our hamstrings most effectively, we need to do a speedy little bit of hamstring anatomy. The hamstrings are made up of 4 different muscles. Closest to the outside, we've got the bicep femoris, which is split into the long head and the short head. The 2 heads have slightly different functions because the short head only crosses the knee joint, which means it's used for knee flexion in exercises like leg curl, whereas the long head crosses the hip and the knee joint, so it's used in exercises that involve hip extension and knee flexion. The semitendinosus and the semimembranosus both cross the hip and the knee joint, so they're involved in hip extension, knee flexion, and internal rotation. So the anatomy tells us that in order to train our hamstrings most effectively, we need to be including both hip extension and knee flexion exercises in our routine, because not all of the hamstring muscles actually cross the hip joint. But as always, before we jump into the ultimate hamstring workout, I've got 3 quick tips for you to help you optimize your hamstring training, then 3 common mistakes that you need to make sure you avoid. Tip number 1 is all about our hip extension movements. You've got a few different options for exercises you could choose. So your main hip extension movements are going to be your conventional deadlift, your sumo deadlift, your stiff leg deadlift, and your Romanian deadlift. Basically any kind of deadlift. Good mornings also work hip extension because it's the same movement pattern as if you were doing a deadlift, just the weight is loaded on your back rather than in your hands. All forms of deadlift activate the hamstrings to a greater extent than squats because you're starting with your hips higher up. That means that your hamstrings are under more stretch and you get more of the movement. In terms of which type of deadlift is the best for growing your hamstrings, the EMG data really doesn't show much significant difference between all the different types. However, when I'm really wanting to focus on hamstring activation, I like to prioritize the deadlift variations where my legs are straighter, so things like the stiff leg deadlift. This is purely because it puts the hamstrings in a position where they're under a greater stretch, so since your hamstrings are under more tension, there could potentially be a greater stimulus for muscle growth. Tip number 2 is going to be really useful if you're someone who trains hamstrings at home, or just if you don't have the equipment available in your gym. It can honestly be really hard to figure out how to train hamstrings at home most effectively because yeah, you can do things like deadlifts and RDLs if you've got dumbbells, but then it's much harder to find exercises that actually work knee flexion. So after a lot of research, I found this study and it looked at the EMG data of 14 different exercises. It found that the best exercise in terms of hamstring activation was actually the sliding leg curl. I really like this exercise as an option for working out at home because you don't need any equipment and the movement actually works knee flexion as well as hip extension because your hips are actively extended as you curl your legs in just because of the position that your body's in. If you've got access to a rowing machine, you can do a similar movement by putting your feet on the seat and then using the seat as sort of a slider to do the same movement. I've never actually tried Pilates, but this sort of movement kind of reminds me of Pilates. I don't know, it just gives me Pilates vibes. Tip number 3, I'm actually going to ask you a question. Which do you think is better, seated leg curl or lying leg curl? No, I can't really hear your answer, but just put it in the comments. Okay, so EMG data has actually shown that there's really not much difference in hamstring activation between the lying leg curl and the seated leg curl. However, it is possible to target different parts of the hamstrings depending on what direction you have your feet. To make it super easy to remember, I just like to think about it as the direction you point your feet is the part of the hamstring that you're going to be working. So if you point your feet outwards, you're going to be working more the outer side of your hamstrings, and if you point your toes inwards, then you're going to be working more of the medial or the inner part of your hamstrings. To be completely honest with you, I just like to do leg curls with my feet pretty much straight because that means I'm going to be working some of the outer side, I'm going to be working some of the inner side. Saying that, if you did have like a noticeable difference in size between the outer part of your hamstring and the inner part of your hamstring, then this is a technique that you might want to consider. But in terms of whether you do seated or lying leg curls, it really all comes down to personal preference. I'd say do what you find most comfortable and the exercise you can do with the best form and you feel like you're getting the most out of. I definitely prefer seated leg curl because I just feel a lot more secure in the machine and I'm able to produce more force with my hamstrings when I'm in that setup. Whereas when I do lying leg curls, I just feel like I'm not as locked in and I feel like it's harder to use the proper form with lying leg curl. Now obviously that's just my opinion and one or the other might work better for you because we're all built different. We've all got different lengths of levers, so it's important that you try both if you've got both available and see which one feels best for you. Okay, now for the mistakes that you need to avoid. The first mistake people make is using squats as a way to grow your hamstrings. I hate to break it to you, but this study shows that squats are actually one of the worst exercises you could choose if you're trying to build your hamstrings. That's not to say that they're bad, they're really good for working other muscle groups like your quads, but for hamstrings, not so much. Let's just think about it for a second. When you squat, you're stretching one end of your hamstrings with the hip extension part of the movement. But then when you bend your knees, you're slackening the other part of your hamstrings, so the net effect is pretty much zero. That means that the overall length of your hamstring is staying pretty constant throughout the whole range of motion of your squat. And that means there's not actually that much tension in your hamstrings in order to stimulate muscle growth. So even just looking back at the study, better exercises that you could use to target your hamstrings are things like deadlifts, just like we talked about earlier. Mistake number 2 is only doing hip extension movements. If you want to build balanced hamstrings, you need to make sure that you're including both hip extension and knee flexion movements. This is because, just thinking back to the anatomy, not all of the hamstring muscles actually cross the hip joint. The bicep femoris short head only crosses the knee joint, which is used for knee flexion. So it's super important if we want to target all 4 of the hamstring muscles that we include both hip extension and knee flexion exercises. Mistake number 3 is only doing low rep training. People used to think that the hamstrings were type 2 or fast twitch fiber dominant, and that meant that you had to work them with low rep ranges, otherwise they wouldn't grow. However, looking at the data from 6 studies, we can see that the hamstrings are actually made up of closer to an even split of fast twitch and slow twitch muscle fibers. The type of fiber relates to how we approach our training in order to maximize growth. So the slow twitch muscle fibers are more for endurance exercises, so they favor higher reps, and then the fast twitch muscle fibers favor the lower rep ranges. So since the hamstrings are roughly an even split, it's important that we include both high rep ranges and lower rep ranges if we want optimal growth. So once you understand how the hamstrings work, then they're not actually that hard to train. But I'm going to take you through the ultimate hamstring workout. So that was quite loud, sorry about that. Actually, first I just want to note, you don't need to train the hamstrings probably quite as much as you think you would. Even if you were just happy with where your hamstrings were at right now, it would only take about 4 sets per week for you to maintain that muscle mass. For some people, you can even grow your hamstrings with between 4 to 6 sets per week. And just thinking about it, that's really not that much volume. But it has been shown to be detrimental in the opposite side of things, such that if you were doing a lot higher volume training, say about 20 sets, then your hamstrings aren't going to be as good at recovering from that, so you could be doing more harm than good in terms of your muscle growth. I'd recommend splitting up your hamstring training into 2 or 3 workouts per week. I personally do this on my leg days, so I have 3 leg days and I put most of my hamstring training in just 2 of those leg days and then one's a more quad focused day. But regardless of when exactly you train your hamstrings, you only need 2 movements to target them effectively. For the first exercise, we're going to do stiff leg deadlifts. I want you to grab the bar with an overhand grip or a mixed grip depending on your preference. You also might want to use lifting choke or lifting straps if your grip is something that you struggle with. And as you're lowering the bar, you want to slowly hinge at your hips and try not to round your back over. If you find yourself starting to round your back, that means that you're taking some of the tension off of your hamstrings and you're starting to shift that onto your back. Really think about retracting your shoulder blades, keeping your spine in a neutral position. You want to keep a soft bend in your knees while thinking of your hips as the hinge point. Different people will have different levels of flexibility, so the distance that you're physically able to move the bar downwards is going to be different. But for most people, in order to keep the tension on your hamstrings, this is going to be just below your knee or slightly mid-shin. There are very few people who actually have the flexibility to get the bar all the way to the ground while keeping their legs in a fairly straight position. But if this is you, then you can use smaller weight plates and put them under your toes to elevate your toes so that you're going to be putting your hamstrings in a more stretched position even before you start the movement. You might have seen people before doing deadlifts standing on plates, but I really don't think this is necessary because a lot of the time you also see these people bending their back over, and that is taking the tension off of their hamstrings. Because of that, they're going to be putting themselves at a much greater risk of injuring their back. For a second exercise, you probably guessed it, but we're going to do a leg curl. I'm going to choose seated leg curl here, but again, it's completely personal preference. You want to pull the top pad down and secure it so it's tight across the top of your legs. Drive your heels down towards your glutes as far as you can without arching your lower back. One technique that I've actually been trying out recently on the leg curl machine is leaning forward slightly. This also acts as a small amount of hip extension, so you're going to be stretching your hamstrings just that little bit more, but it does make the exercise itself that bit harder. I've not really seen any studies showing the effect that leaning forward slightly has on hamstring growth, but I'll make sure to keep my eye out and keep you guys updated. So on the days where you're doing lower rep hip extension movements, I want you to do higher rep knee flexion movements. Say for leg day number 1, you could do 2 sets of 4 to 8 reps of stiff leg deadlifts, followed by 3 sets of 12 to 15 reps of seated leg curl. Then on your next leg day, you want higher rep hip extension movements and lower rep knee flexion movements. Just make sure that you don't do more than 10 sets for hamstrings per leg workout, because then you're getting into the sort of zone where you might not be able to recover from it. So now you're equipped with everything you need to know to go and grow your hamstrings. Don't do what I did, don't skip hamstrings, it's very important. And it's also very important that you subscribe, because if you're not, then you're gonna miss the whole muscle growth series, and we've already done like 5. Make sure you comment which is your favorite, seated leg curl or lying leg curl, because I genuinely want to know. I love chatting to you guys and I respond to all my comments. I honestly appreciate you so much more than you know, and if you enjoyed this video, you're definitely gonna enjoy this one next. See you there.